nerves kick in and you feel like having to take a nap, please do so quietly at that party. So it's a great pleasure to be able to address you this afternoon, and my thanks to Mrs. Sung Kim and Ginny for organizing this together and extending the invitation. So I guess the useful information here is my email address, and if you have any additional questions or if you are in need of resources, please email me and I'll be happy to provide directions, right? Most of the topics that I will cover today, I've written about as an academic, and so I could also share with you my own research on the topic. So my job today is to, as a specialist in Korean American experience, make the connection between the lecture earlier today on Korea, and then leverage that information to talk about, how and what and who of Korean American experience, and bring it to today. What I think I would do, what I would like to do is lecture on the Korean American experience, as that's like the most efficient way for me to get through that material. And then I think I would like to open it up for some structured discussion on the connection between Korea and the United States today, right? Whatever was happening between Korea and the United States, the second term of Donald Trump has made all people who claim any expertise to be absolute novices, because who knows what he's going to say tomorrow that is going to upturn everything we thought we knew about Korea-US relations. And so I didn't mean to sound so angry about this, but I thought maybe a better way of doing it is to just sort of open it up for additional discussion. And a very interesting spin from the Korean Cultural Center this time around is, I gather they have prizes, right? And so there should be a quiz at the end. And so my strategy is to give you like the information up front and then revisit that information as 3 quiz questions to try and figure out like whether you absorbed all this information or not. So take good notes for the quiz at the end. Okay. All right. So in terms of the history of Korean Americans, what we need to do is go into our time machine and go back to the mid-1800s, right? And what is very interesting about Korean American experience is that it gives us an opportunity to not just think about Korea or even Asian history, but global history, right? And so what happens in Korea is that this part of the global geography becomes articulated into world history. And it takes a very long time for that to happen, and it will not happen until the mid-1800s, right? And so we know that from like much earlier, there were these relationships, of course, between East Asia and Europe, but that happened before the age of empire and imperialism, right? That gave East Asia and the rest of the world a much harsher treatment of forced incorporation, right? So the story is Europe comes out of the Dark Ages, and what Europeans figure out is, it is useful and valuable to build empires. It allows us to build markets, it allows us to leverage cheap labor, it allows us to grab natural resources, And it also allows us to send unhappy people in our country, put them on these ships, and dispatch them to remote parts of our empire, right? And so, Europe begins to do this, and it starts with the Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, India, Southeast Asia, on and on and on, right? And we all know, of course, that that was the process that brought this part of the world into an articulation of global systems, right? And it's the search for spice routes, a way to go to China and India that North America and the Western Hemisphere is sort of put on a map by European forces and so on. Okay? So this part of the world receives this treatment beginning in the 1800s, right? At the very last stages of this age of empire and conquest, one could say. And the primary actor in this is China. And China faces pressures by Great Britain to open itself up to British trade. And the incident that precipitates China's incorporation into this global system is the trade of opium, right? And so China fights two wars against United Kingdom for UK's exorbitant privilege of trading opium in China so that they could balance their trade as they take tea, porcelain, and silk out of Chinese economy, right? And by fighting against these two, by fighting against Great Britain, what China becomes is it becomes a great big, I wanted to say Turkey, but maybe it's not. Let's just say a great big Thanksgiving turkey where all these other European powers come and demand their share, right? China loses its control over its nation and is being carved up, right? I just recently returned from Beijing, and if you go to Beijing or Shanghai, you see the architectural remnants of this even now, as you find German Quarter, French Quarter, British Quarter, and concessions in those cities, and so on. But this idea that it happens in 1800s implicates the United States in this process. A country that was a British colony that secures its independence, achieves its manifest destiny as a nation that goes from sea to shining sea, and then after where this part of the country, which was part of Mexico, after this part of the country is absorbed, United States says, what's next? And the answer to that question, of course, is Asia, right? And so Japan is the country that United States pries open, right? Commodore Perry sails to Shizuoka and tells the shogunate, I will come back for an answer. You either sign a treaty with us or we will wage war, right? And so I also happened to come back from Japan. This is not a lie. And if you go to Tokyo Bay, you'll see these artificial islands. And what were those artificial islands for? For cannon placements, because the Japanese really thought they will fight a war with the United States. But then cooler heads prevailed, and what happens in Japan is they sign an agreement with the United States. In order to do what? To buy time. The Japanese just saw what happened to China. And so they understand if they fight against the United States, they will meet the fate of China, and Japan would be carved up by Western powers. So the idea is we will sign this treaty and build ourselves into a modern nation. And that would include not only industrialization, but becoming an empire of their own. Because what they see among Europeans is that what it means to be a powerful nation is to go on conquest. And in order to do that, you need to have an army and a navy and a crash course on modernization and build up your military, right? So that's what happens. And so the country, as you saw this morning, that pries open Korea out of its hermit kingdom period into a place that is articulated into the global system. It's not a European country, and it's not even the United States, it's Japan. And Japan comes in and pries open Korea. So Korea has to sign these treaties, and then Japan's idea for Korea is not that it's going to be a far-flung colony, but it's going to be an immediate and essential part of Japan that'll serve as a land bridge into the mainland of Asia, right? Into China and so on. It's like the most important geography in the Japanese empire, right? And so eventually Korea is not just a colony, but it becomes part of Japan, right? Koreans are not colonial subjects, they are Japanese nationals. They're not Japanese citizens, but they are what's euphemistically called emperor's people. And they have all the responsibilities and liabilities of citizens of Japan or Japanese society, but not equal privileges and rights and opportunities of the Japanese. The person that I want you to think about this issue through is a man by the name of Horace Allen, who's pictured here. And Horace Allen represents a kind of an American that is running around the world, right? They were the ones who came to California when California was part of Mexico, and married Mexican women and ingratiated themselves into Californial families, right? These are the young Americans who went to China to become fabulously wealthy merchants who would, in many ways, bankroll America's establishment in the 1800s and 1900s, right? And so Horace Allen receives a classic liberal arts education. He is a physician. He's a medical doctor, and he seeks to make his mark, not in Korea, but in China, right? So he goes to China, and he has two amazing relationships. One is the relationship with his knowledge of medicine, Western medicine. He could perform miracles on the bodies of these Asians, right? The other relationship is that he's also a missionary, Methodist missionary. So he has a special relationship with God. And he's going to tell these Asians what it means to be saved. You know what I mean? He gets into some entanglements in China, and so he has to skedaddle. And so many of these characters, Americans who end up in Korea, have interesting stories of how they had to leave China or Japan and ended up in Korea. So he comes to Korea, and he wants an audience with the king. Long story short, there's a nephew of Queen Min, who's a considerable character in Korean royal court. Her beloved nephew is ill, and Horace Allen cures him and becomes a close friend and advisor to the royal family. Horace Allen's big idea is this, and that is, King of Korea one of these days you're going to lose your country, because Japan's ambition is to absorb all of Korea and turn Korea into a Japanese territory. The amazing advice he gives is that for Korea to exist in the world, you have to send Koreans out of Korea, right? And the place that you should send them to is Hawaii, because Hawaii is going to become an American territory, and America is a very powerful country, and one of these days, Japan and America will go to war, and if you send these Koreans into Hawaii, they will advocate for Korea's independence, right? And they will be a savior of your nation. So it's a wild idea. It also turns out that Horace Allen was working with a labor agent in Hawaii named David Deschler. And it turns out one of the reasons maybe why he gave that advice was because he was secured as a labor recruiter to Hawaii's plantations, right? Okay, so that's the big idea. Dr. Horace Allen is such a significant figure in Korea. If you go to Seoul and you drive by the Yonsei University campus and there's the Severance Hospital, he's the dude who created that hospital, right? He is intimately tied to the success of American Protestant missionaries, their good work on building hospitals and universities, and then sending these Koreans out of Korea, right? And so that's an amazing thing. And without some level of self-dealing and corruption, right? And so history comes to us with both a virtue and crass commercial interest. So that's Horace Allen. Korea then gets plunged into a political crisis, right? There would be Sino-Japanese War, there would be Russo-Japanese War, and both of these wars are over the control of Korea. And Chinese are kicked out, Russians are kicked out. Americans are not kicked out because America, in an interesting way, becomes a partner of Korea's colonization with Japan, right? Japan and America have this agreement that says America would respect Japanese ambitions in Korea if the Japanese respects America's ambitions in the Philippines, right? And so this is like two imperial powers who understand their interests. But like all agreements that are made on morally suspect grounds, in the end, Japan will invade the Philippines, right? And America will end up, dropping 2 atomic bombs in Japan to end the Second World War. All right. So by 1910, Korea is Japan. Korea is literally wiped off the world's map. So I don't know if anybody have seen maps that were drawn from 1910 to 1945. There is no Korea. It's just a Japanese empire. So one of the reasons why Koreans might be so nationalistic in some ways might have something to do with this idea that they literally faced an existential threat to their existence, right? So that's an interesting idea. So once Japan absorbs Korea, there are policies of assimilation, industrialization, and conscription, right? And so what that means is the idea is that Korean culture must be tamped down and over time made to disappear, right? The language of instruction in the public schools that the Japanese bring is Japanese. The assimilation idea, Koreans take on Japanese names, so on my mother's side, their Japanese name was Takaji, and it was just an enormous source of shame and embarrassment that for 36 years they lived as a Japanese people, right, in my family. But I'm old enough to remember, I just turned, I'm gonna be 61 soon. I still remember that my grandparents would speak Japanese if they didn't want to be understood by children. So that's the idea. Korea would be industrialized, and Koreans would be conscripted by Japanese government to be dispatched to Japan to work, or to the Pacific Islands during Second World War to build infrastructure. If you go to, Hiroshima or Nagasaki and go to the atomic, museum and memorial, there will be sections that shows how the Koreans worked in the mines, and because of the atomic bomb, they all were perished, by those actions, right? The policy of assimilation, I kind of, my big idea when I lecture is to just tell you some stories, like I did with, Horace Allen, so that you folks would remember. So in 1946, year after the Second World War, what happens in Hawaii, in Honolulu, is that they bring a baseball team from Korea to play a baseball game with the Korean American children in Hawaii, right? But these children could not communicate with each other. And the reason why was because Korean Americans in Hawaii could speak fluent Korean because they all had to go to Korean language schools, right? These days it's like on a Sunday at a church, but back in those days it was much more serious, right? 5 days, all afternoon, Korean children would have to study Korean. So the Korean American kids in Hawaii spoke fluent Korean, but the Korean kids from Korea, they only spoke Japanese. And so these Korean patriots would just sob, at this reality. And so that's why Koreans are a bit sensitive about their language and culture. And if you tell any Korean that maybe kimchi came from China, or China has something similar to Korean kimchi, they'll lose their shit. You know what I'm saying? And so that's, I'm not trying to excuse them, but I'm providing academic context, right? Now, one of the first things that the Japanese do once 1910 happens, there's no Korean political leaders, right? It's the Japanese governor general, right, who makes all the rules in Korea. And one of the things that happens is that the Japanese government prevents Koreans from immigrating to the United States, right? And that's because as soon as Koreans come to Hawaii or to California, they think of their mission in life as resisting Japanese imperialism, right? So they create organizations, they do fundraisers, they hold meetings and events they're doing what Horace Allen advised them to do, and that is, you are our best hope. If Korea is going to exist, it's all on you, right? It's all on you. So that's just an incredible responsibility that they had. But from Japan's point of view, these are like the biggest troublemakers, biggest pain in the butt. And so why would you let them go to the US, right? But what Japan also finds out is that movement of human beings across geographic space is something that governments cannot 100% control. So there would be a stream of Koreans that come to the United States, and they're called exile students because they were young people. They were students. Many of them were literally students. And they're in exile because invariably they were arrested by the Japanese police, served time in prison, and then as soon as they got out, helpful American missionaries sponsored them to escape to the United States, right? And they came to the US, right? Today, so what happens is during this time, there's a great big rock that is, sort of dropped on this Korean pond, and all these Koreans begin splattering out of that pond, and they seek opportunity, refuge outside of Korea, right? And so that's the formation of Korean diaspora that continues to this day. I just came back from Vietnam, and there's now over 200,000 Koreans living in Vietnam, which is an amazing number, and we can talk more about that when we talk about Koreans. This is the Hirobumi Ito pictured above. I think on Netflix there's a movie about the assassination of the Governor General of Japan. You see the independence movement below. All right, so that's the context of Koreans having to leave Korea, right? Korea is literally being invaded and absorbed by the Japanese, by Japan. Koreans are people who are politically and economically and socially dislocated, and little over 10,000 of them will make it to the United States and to Hawaii, right? And they are the core they are the totality of the Korean American community in the United States. Now, here in California, what happens to Koreans is that they're incorporated into California's economy. And there's this Asian American story in California that will absorb them into this system, right? And so when the Chinese arrive in the 1860s, right, they begin with the gold rush of 1849, but substantial numbers of them will make their way into California by 1860. And what the Chinese do that is like most significant economically is not only build a railroad, which is an unbelievable accomplishment, but they also build these earthen levees that control these wild rivers of California, right? And it turns California into the fruit and vegetable basket of this country. Combine that with refrigerated railroad cars, California's economy is transformed. But the problem is California lacks the white population to do this agriculture. California also practices large-scale agribusiness type of agriculture. So it's not family farms. They're dependent on a class of people who have to chase the crops up and down the coast, right? And of course, this is the reality that California has to this day, the west coast of the United States, right? and it falls on the most marginalized people to do this. Right? And before Mexicans arrived in large numbers because of the Mexican Revolution, it fell to Asians to do this work. So the Chinese do this work. The Chinese are excluded by 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Japanese do this work. They become excluded through the Gentleman's Agreement of 1902. And that's when Koreans arrive, right, to do this work. And so that's the